Shamada. How can a proud and brave people like the Ashanti sit back and look while white men take away their king and chiefs and humiliate them with demands for the golden stool? The golden stool only means money to the white man. They've searched and dug everywhere for it. She continued, if you, the chiefs of the Ashanti, are going to behave like cowards and not fight, you should exchange your loincloths for my undergarments. Ouch! What would you do if you were a chief? She then grabbed a rifle and fired it into the air and declared war on the British. The War of the Golden Stool had started. Now, whether they were in awe, inspired, or simply shocked, we don't know. But after that display, the assembled men appointed Ya Asantewa as their military commander, a role traditionally filled by men. The resulting war goes by several names. Technically, it was the 5th Anglo-Ashanti War. The British also called it the 3rd Ashanti Expedition, seeing as 2 of the previous conflicts had been defensive wars following Ashanti invasions of the Gold Coast. But to many Ashanti and Ghanaians, it is known as the Ya Asantewa War. Now, apart from haranguing the chiefs and firing a rifle over their heads, this African Joan of Arc had another trick to galvanise the men into action. She urged women to withhold sex from their husbands unless they agreed to fight. Yep, that would probably do the trick. Meanwhile, blissfully unaware of the trouble he had set in motion, Hodgson now poured petrol on the flames when the next day he sent Armitage, accompanied by some troops, out to look for the golden stool. That afternoon, the party was surrounded by armed and very agitated Ashanti. Armitage decided to give them an example of British stiff upper lip and ordered his men to take afternoon tea. Folding chairs and tables were erected and tea duly served. I mean, it's like something from Carry On Up the Khyber. Although the Ashanti didn't see the funny side. They'd had enough and they opened fire. Armitage and his men fled back towards Kumasi. Arriving in the capital during a rainstorm, he reported the alarming news to Hodgson, who immediately moved into the small fort. He was accompanied by his wife, 16 Europeans, and 300 armed Hausa from Nigeria, who also possessed 6 7-pound mountain guns and 4 Maxim machine guns. As the news of the event spread, European and African civilians also turned up looking for safety. Whilst they had the numbers, the Ashanti were, rather wisely, cautious of the narrow front on which they would have to attack, and even more so, the carnage that those Maxims could inflict upon them. Consequently, they only made one serious assault on the fort, a few days later, on the 29th of April 1900, and then contented themselves with starving the British into submission, with the odd potshots from snipers to keep the British heads down. Meanwhile, down on the coast, the British authorities knew something was up when the telegraph lines to Kumasi were cut. A scratch force of local troops was assembled and sent north through the jungle. Eventually, after a month, having battled through barriers blocking the primitive road, they arrived at the Ashanti capital. If Hodgson was expecting to turn the tables on the Ashanti and their gun-totting female leader, he was sadly disappointed. Of the 250-strong force that had arrived from the coast, half were either wounded or were ill from tropical diseases. And worse, they had actually brought no extra supplies with them. So now they almost doubled the number of mouths that needed feeding and swelled the ranks of the besieged to nearly 600 people in the tiny fort. Already working on almost starvation rations and with disease spreading through his command, Hodgson watched as dozens died daily. And with no room for burials inside, their bodies were simply thrown outside the tiny fort. It would be another month before further assistance arrived. In June 1900, a second column, numbering 700 troops from the West African Field Force under Major Morris, battled their way through to Kumasi. En route, they had met determined opposition at a series of stockades that the Ashanti had built. These defensive fortifications were a departure from traditional Ashanti tactics, which some have credited to Ya Asantewa, although that's not definite. Whoever devised them, the stockades were proving a major headache for the advancing British. At one such fortification, on the 6th of June, Sergeant John Mackenzie of the Seaforth Highlanders, but on secondment to the West Africa Frontier Force, worked 2 Maxims single-handed whilst under fire and wounded, before leading a bayonet charge which eventually captured the stockade. He was one of 2 men awarded the Victoria Cross during the War of the Golden Stool, and I'll tell you about the other one in a little while. By the time they reached Hodgson's Fort, most of this force were also suffering from malnutrition. The governor now called a council of war, and it was agreed that the occupants of the fort, now numbering nearly 1,000, needed to break out or die of starvation. In the dead of night on the 23rd of June, most of the soldiers in the fort silently slipped out. They left behind most of the weakened civilian refugees, along with 25 fit and 90 slightly invalided troops, under the command of a captain and a medical officer, and were told to hold on as long as they could. The evacuation was so quiet that the Ashanti were caught completely by surprise, and it took them 2 days to assemble a large force to give chase. But Hodgson's fleeing party had a head start, and having fought both to clear villages en route and rear guards against their pursuers, they finally crossed the Pra River that marked the border, and their pursuers gave up. They'd lost 2 British officers and 39 Nigerian Hulsa troops during their flight to safety. By the time that Hodgson had reached the coast, with his ailing wife being carried in a hammock, the Ashanti had something else to concentrate their minds. Another relief column was marching through the tough terrain towards Kumasi. And this time, the British meant business. Commanded by Major James Wilcox, this column consisted of 1,000 men, drawn from the Nigerian Regiment of the West Africa Frontier Force, the West Africa Regiment, the Central Africa Regiment, which would later become part of the King's Africa Rifles, the Sierra Leone Frontier Police, and detachments from the 1st and 2nd West Indian Regiments. Born in India in 1857, where his father was serving in the East India Company Army, Wilcox was a tough veteran of wars in Afghanistan, Sudan, Burma, and the Waziri expedition on the northwest frontier of India. He had been in command of the West Africa Field Force since 1898, and had confidently, if not bullishly, announced that he would enter Kumasi on the 15th of July, the day that the tiny garrison's food supplies were predicted to run out. To assist him in his endeavour, apart from his 1,000 fighting men, he also had 6 artillery pieces and 6 Maxim machine guns. This was some firepower against the Ashanti, who, whilst numerically superior, and many were armed with rifles, which they fired with impressive accuracy, were not the fighting force that Garnet Wolseley had encountered back in the 1870s. The confident Wilcox insisted on using bayonet charges to clear the stockades, and on one occasion, at Kokofu, his cavalier tactics rebounded on him, as his force were initially repulsed, losing over 80 men, mainly wounded. By the time his Yoruba troops had re-entered the stockade, they found it deserted. That, however, was his only setback, as his column relentlessly moved through the jungle towards the Ashanti capital, finally arriving on the 15th of July, just as he had promised. The garrison was so feeble that they couldn't even cheer his arrival, and many could barely stand. Having secured Kumasi, Major Wilcox immediately sent out flying columns to secure the remaining stockades. On the 30th of September, the final stockade at Obasa fell to yet another bayonet charge, this time led by Captain John Mellis. The officer, who was serving in the North Nigeria Regiment, which was part of the West Africa Frontier Force, was awarded the 2nd Victoria Cross of the campaign. Back in London, the Colonial Secretary, Joseph Chamberlain, announced the news of the Ashanti defeat. However, with the Boer War and the Boxer Rising in China in full flow, many MPs hardly bothered to comment. Although the young firebrand Liberal MP for Carnarvon, David Lloyd George, questioned why so much money had been spent and so many lives had been lost for the sake of a golden stool. He also questioned whether Governor Hodgson had requested the golden stool with government approval, or whether the whole war had been the result of his arrogance and ignorance. And Lloyd George was right to question both the morality of the war and its cost. British casualties, dead and wounded, numbered just over 1,000, and whilst figures for the Ashanti have been hard to determine, it's thought to number 2,000. The Kingdom of the Proud Ashanti was annexed into the British Empire as a Crown colony in 1901. Ya Asentewa was exiled to the Seychelles, along with another 30 senior Ashanti chiefs and leaders. The warrior Queen Mother would die on the Indian Ocean Islands in 1921, having never seen her homeland again. She is regarded as a national hero or heroine in Ghana to this day. And what happened to some of those characters who we've encountered in this story? Well, Sir Frederick Hodgson was moved sideways to become Governor of Barbados, which possibly indicates that the British government shared Lloyd George's views on his responsibility for starting the war. He died in 1925, aged 73. James Wilcox would go on to serve as a general on the Western Front during the First World War. Despite being in his 60s, he would twice be mentioned in dispatches. Finally becoming Governor of Bermuda, he died in 1926. Of the two men awarded the Victoria Cross, both Captain John Mellis and Sergeant John Mackenzie would also serve in the First World War. Mellis, rising to the rank of Major General in the Indian Army, would be hospitalised during the campaign in Mesopotamia, modern-day Iraq, and was captured at the Fall of Kut. He spent the rest of the war as a Turkish prisoner. John Mellis VC died in 1934 and is buried in the churchyard at Frimley in Surrey. Sergeant Mackenzie would rise from the ranks to become an officer in the Beds and Hearts Regiment. Major John Mackenzie VC was killed leading his men over the top on the Western Front in 1915. King Prempeh I of the Ashanti was finally allowed to return home in 1924 after 28 long years in exile. He would continue his reign until his death in 1931. He was succeeded as monarch by his nephew, Prempeh II. And what of the golden stool that had sparked this whole war? Well, it remained hidden, and the British would never get their hands, let alone their bums, on it. In 1921, the British finally renounced their claims to the golden stool. And somewhat ironically, just when it was finally safe from the British, it was discovered by some African workmen who proceeded to strip it of some of its precious metal. Tried according to local custom, they were sentenced to death, only for the British to intervene and banish the culprits into exile instead. Eventually brought out of hiding, the golden stool was used at the coronation of Prempeh II. The monarchs of the Ashanti continue to reign to this day inside Ghana and continue to act as custodians of the golden stool. Well, I hope you enjoyed that story from the tail end of Queen Victoria's British Empire. It's a little known story in Britain, but sure as heck in the Ashanti region of Ghana, it is well remembered and very proudly so. And once more, thank you to HelloFresh for sponsoring this show, and don't forget to click on the link on the screen or in the description and use the exclusive code THC50 to get 50% off your first box along with 20% discounts on your following 2 months, plus those free desserts. Thanks for joining me today. Keep well, and I'll see you again very soon.